it's 12:15 on the master clock. Who here, just show of hands, thought this was lunch? Awesome, good. You're actually here for post-compromise persistence and detection within IDPs, which is a lot longer of a title. My name is Chaim. I'm the head of security operations for Lyft. Just a quick note on that. Me and my team spend all day trying to make sure riders, drivers, employees at Lyft are safe and secure and ensure the privacy and security of all of you. If that's something that you're interested in, if you're in an identity conference, I really hope that that's a differentiator for you. Please consider taking a Lyft on your way to the parties tonight or dinner or even just your hotel. I know I'd appreciate it. That being said, none of the things I'm going to say in this presentation reflect the opinions or ideals of my employer. So just be aware of that as well. The normal disclosure applies here. Cool. Now this should be an easy question. Show of hands, who here uses a single sign-on provider? Right, okay, so maybe the audience is a little bit biased at an identity conference, but these have become really prolific within our industry, and it's for good reason. They provide things like onboarding, offboarding, authentication, authorization, security policy enforcement, multi-factor, right? They add new things every year. We actually heard in the Ping Identity keynote yesterday a similar statement to what I'm about to say, though. All of those things being put into one place, turns out that's a problem in some respects. It's a double-edged sword. If that environment gets compromised, you have a problem. So what do we mean by compromised? We mean a system administrator. So for instance, imagine that your system administrator themselves is compromised. That could mean that their device is compromised, their accounts are compromised, or it could mean something completely different, like they themselves have been compromised. They're maybe been bribed, or perhaps they're just disgruntled. I think we can all relate to that. How do you respond? Now, I have 25 minutes, of which 5 minutes are going to hopefully be left for questions, so I can't answer that in a detailed answer. That would take days. I'm going to try and do a nice overview. I'm also going to stick to 2 IDPs for this particular example, but we're going to try and talk on topics that apply to all IDPs. So we're going to talk about Okta and Azure AD today. That being said, if you have a different IDP, maybe it's open source, maybe it's on-prem, maybe the different logo is a different color, maybe the CEO smokes a different color cigar, these should all be generally applicable, right? So we have 2 different approaches that we're going to take. These are not new, not revolutionary. Prevention and then detection. We're obviously only going to talk a little bit about prevention because the title talked about detection. So I'm going to have one slide on that, and then we'll jump into the meat of the detection and persistence mechanisms. Sound good? Cool. I'm seeing at least one nod. I'm feeling good about that. Cool. So prevention has 2 really good approaches here. Reducing your administrators and their capabilities is a really strong approach. I'm happy to report that as of now, like 2 years, both Azure and Okta have really reasonable role-based access control for administrators that you can use. Does everybody use it? No. Is that a real shame? Absolutely. Additionally, configuration management tools like Plumi or Terraform that you're probably familiar with can provide great capabilities in this space to reduce overall amounts of administrators. Even though Azure and Okta both have Terraform providers, that doesn't mean that they're full-featured. So you're going to always end up having an administrator, or usually many administrators still in these days. Still really important part of a disaster recovery plan. If you were at the last talk, that's something you can consider. The other thing for administrators is the same prescription we give to our users. Seems super crazy, but like, don't use just passwords as an administrator. Multi-factor authentication is kind of cool. I know nobody in this room is doing that, but it would surprise you to learn the amount of organizations that do have that, coupled with the fact that this is still the default. So if you set up a new Okta account or a new Azure AD account, you're going to just get a password. You're not even going to get SMS. Now, everybody here is thinking, multi-factor authentication, I got that. Most of you are thinking about WebAuthn or FIDO2 or both, and are not yet at that place yet, so you're still using like an OTP or a push. Hopefully most of you have moved along from that. We've seen those attacked in commodity, using commodity tools. A good example of that is the Uber breach from a couple months ago, as you all are probably familiar with. But just because you're on multi-factor phishing resistant based MFA doesn't mean you're immune from everything, in spite of some of the talks that you might have seen today, which is super good. Right? I was talking to a healthcare provider who shall remain nameless, and they get, we've figured it out, we're on password lists, it's amazing. And I go, cool, how are you doing that? And they're like, we deployed YubiKeys to everybody. I was like, good first step. So like, what's your other factor? And they're like, other factor? And I was like, well, what if someone takes that, right? And they're like, the look of panic on that CISO's face was amazing. But even if you have good WebAuthn, many of the IDPs, including the ones that we're talking about today, still have the capability to steal a session. It seems crazy in this day and age that it's not linked to a specific IP, probably a convenience thing. You may or may not have known that. And even if all of that is fixed, your endpoint could still be compromised. And I know some of you are thinking, oh, signals from your EDR, it's going to solve the problem. Let's take the Okta breach from last year as an example. It was like VNC, right? That's not going to be caught by your EDR. And what are you going to do with the 5 minutes where your admin gets up, goes and takes a break, gets some food, whatever, comes back? We're going to talk about what that's going to look like. Cool. One of the things I'm super disappointed about, re-ups for high-risk activities are not available on either of these platforms. Wouldn't it be really great if we added a MFA re-up to do, I don't know, a Upstream IDP? That seems like a pretty rare event. Seems like something that we could probably add some re-ups for. Exciting opportunities in the future for IDPs. All right. I promised you that we would talk about detection primarily and persistence mechanisms. That's why you're here. We're going to talk about 6 general categories, and then if I have time, we'll dive into a few IDP-specific vectors, but mostly those are just there to whet your appetite. The first one, and this is also going to explain how I'm going to rate these, is talking about delegated credentials. Most of you are thinking this probably when you're like, as an attacker, what would I do if I compromised in an Okta instance? In this particular case, we'll start off with the good, move to the bad, and then talk about the ugly, and then you'll kind of get the drift as we go through other types. The good, API tokens. All of these have high, terrible impacts if they're backed up, but it's all about detection today. So inside the UI, most administrators are familiar with API tokens, yeah? Yeah, I think they are. They're in a special section. Administrators visit it. They know if they see something bad there, there's probably something they should report. Logs, likewise, pretty easy to read. Even Timmy's first SIM is looking for API tokens being created as a factor of compromise. This is good. Now, Azure doesn't have API tokens in the traditional sense. They're going to use OAuth API tokens. Most of you are thinking, oh, that's good. You know, instead of just a bearer token, it's going to pop up a browser window. Everybody's feeling great. I type in my password. Now, you're at an identity conference, so you probably know that that's not the only OAuth flow that exists, right? Client credentials flow is not all we have, or code credentials flow is not all we have. We have client credentials flow as well, which is effectively just a token, again, for authentication, right? Machine-to-machine authentication by design. But the problem here is within the UI, these are treated as applications. So this is getting slightly worse. How many of you monitor every application that's added? Maybe the number is less than all of you who monitor every API token that's added. Additionally, within the UI, it's very difficult to look at every application. I know most people have hundreds or thousands of applications within their environment, and not every administrator is familiar with each application in a detailed environment. This is a sort of new flow for Okta, so I gave it a little bit of a knock there in terms of logs, just because client creds flow as an API integration or API service is sort of new for them. Now let's talk about when this looks bad, right? Like trusted origins. Azure is going to use app proxies, which is a little bit of a different model. This is effectively a CORS exception. A couple other IDPs support this. In Okta, we're not going to get any logs for setting this up, and let's take a look at what this looks like. All right, let's see if I can do this. All right, cool. As an attacker, I come in, I've compromised the environment, I'm setting up a CORS exception, in this case for chaimsanders.com, just a selfless plug. Here I add this CORS exception, which is great. And now I'm going to show you that there's nothing up my sleeve. We have 4 users, users 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now let's switch to the victim view. Here I've sent a link to the victim. In this case, it pops up a dialog, but it's all just AJAX, right? I could send this as malvertising or whatever. And because the domain is trusted now by my backend, I undertake any of those actions. And I undertake them as the logged in user. So anytime the admin's logged in. As I said, there's no logs about this being done, so you're going to have to use the API or the UI in order to determine when this occurs. This is not something that people go into very often. I think most people think CORS is some sort of black magic. That's probably mostly true, except for the people who wrote it. So this is kind of a good example of a really, really good persistence mechanism, right? Like this would be pretty difficult, and you could use it later in order to increase your capabilities, create an app, do any of the things we're going to talk about today. All right, so we talked about built-in delegation capabilities. Let's talk about shifting my authentication somewhere else. Now we're going to talk about things like AD, LDAP, Radius. Most of you are familiar with this. We actually just talked about this in the previous talk if you were here. These are actually pretty clear and apparent within your environments. So in both Okta and Azure, these are going to be on your dashboards. And when an administrator sees a new Active Directory added, I think that's going to set up some red flags for most of you. Now, a different conversation would be upstream IDPs. This is in a different area that admins don't usually visit. How many of you have set up upstream IDPs? Yeah, it doesn't happen that often. It does happen, right? Mergers and acquisitions are a good example. Partners, it does happen. But I would say that most regular like IT Okta admins are not that comfortable with the upstream IDP flow. It's complicated. So you as an attacker setting one up actually in the UI is very effective. And we're going to take a look at doing that with Azure and what that looks like. The same thing is true with custom factors and custom controls. Some people are a little bit confused about how these work because they're not that common yet. The simplest scenario is to think that you might have an upstream multi-factor authentication provider, like a Duo. And they're going to integrate usually via OIDC, and you can apply custom factors. Typically, you get to name them. So as an attacker, if I set up my own custom factor, I can call it the same thing that someone's using, right? I can call it FIDO2. Nothing's stopping me from doing that. That's pretty good. And these are called custom controls. To be fair to Azure, they're in preview right now, but they don't have any logs when you add them, which is always good. All right, so this is what an upstream IDP looks like in Azure when you get going. This is your classic Azure AD. What we've done is we've gone into this area, which is external identity providers, and we've set up a domain that has an Okta upstream IDP attached to it. You can do a custom one as well. This one's going for any user that has chaimsanders.com set up. So in this case, we've added a user, IDP test at chaimsanders.com. You actually get to see the identifier, which is better than how it's set up in Okta when you do a similar thing. But as the attacker later, I go to the organization, I type in my org domain. Now I can type in that user account. Instead of going through the Microsoft flow, we get redirected to the upstream IDP. Most of you are familiar with this. In this case, this is an Okta instance. This is the attacker-controlled instance, right? Once that happens, it goes back, and then they logged in to the admin portal. This is not crazy. All of these are sort of features, right? These are not bugs. These are just features. They just happen to be very dangerous features. Cool. So all of you are like, wow, those are really complicated attack vectors, Chaim. Can't I just add a user? Yeah, actually, this turns out to be a pretty effective mechanism to persist within an environment. It's because there are thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of users within an Azure AD or a Okta environment. Adding one user can become very difficult to detect, I should say. Now, this becomes pretty cool and interesting because as a company, there are things you can do about this. You can start thinking about the idea that most of these are going to come from an upstream system, like a Workday or an Active Directory. And so you can start monitoring for ones that aren't made there. However, most people have service accounts. These are not made there. So you can start having custom business logic that's able to detect this kind of thing, but it's still going to be really difficult. Same thing for groups. Factor modifications happens to be one of my favorites here as well. It turns out that for flexibility reasons, you could add additional factors. So if your organization uses push, but the attacker comes in and adds security questions, then they can configure the security question for any user they want and use that as a factor going on. That in Azure looks a little bit weird, and we're actually going to see this a couple times. This is what the logs for this look like. You might not be able to see this in the back, but you'll be able to see the important part. It says that an authentication method policy has been updated, which is great. And then what has been changed? Well, I'm not ChatGPT, but that's pretty difficult to read as a log. I hope your SIM knows how to parse that, or if it doesn't, like, shit, I guess is the real answer. Cool, so we're gonna keep going, right? Selective policy enforcement is really kind of the whole story here, right? Where you could do something like use cores to create a user and then create a policy and then apply that policy with a new enforcement method. We're going to see a picture of that in a couple seconds or a video of that. Global session policies and auths auth policies are all combined in Azure. You might know them as conditional access policies. It's all roughly the same thing. The idea here is also simple. Within the UI, global session policies, there's usually not that many of them, but auth policies, these are specific how you log into an app, and there are usually very many of them, and they're usually very confusing, even for people who are used to dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, and this is true across all IDPs usually. Now, this becomes a particularly interesting situation within Okta because of a reason that we'll see in just a few seconds, but within Azure, we end up with the same problem where there's this big JSON blob as the output. Within Okta, we end up with something like this. So we're going to have an AWS account federation auth policy. This is your policy for setting or connecting to AWS. And we're going to add a rule. No problem. This is going to be called a test rule. We're going to add that user that we just added with cores. Super nice. And this can all be done via the API, obviously, but it's more pretty this way. Now we're going to say only one factor, and I don't care what that factor is. And one of those factors is, in fact, a custom IDP factor, which is Duo Universal Prompt. Is a custom factor, and I'm going to add it. What do the logs for that look like? That's the big question. So here we are. I promise you there's nothing up my sleeve. If you can't read the logs when I do it, the bottom log is the target. It's going to say, hey, there's a new rule called test rule, and there's a policy, and it applies to AWS. Does anyone notice what's missing here? What added? Yeah, what changed? There's no information about the user that now has this exception or the policy that that exception applies to. And if this happens to you and someone changes it and then changes it back, the only way that you'll possibly ever know what changed is if you have detection running in some other thing outside of Okta, or maybe you ask Okta and hope they have the logs. That's kind of fun. So one of the last areas we're going to dive into in any sort of deep way is application persistence. So some of these get really, you give IDPs a hard time because you got to understand the environment where they came up with, where big customers are coming in and saying, hey, I need integrations with this really important app to me. And the best way for them to provide that is to make a custom little facet. Think about your integrations with Workday or your integrations with AWS. All of these are going to be sort of custom. This means that, first off, they're going to be configured at the application level within the IDP. That makes it really difficult as an admin if you're looking in the UI to try and find that something's changed. How often do you look at your AWS config within your IDP? Probably not that often, hopefully. A lot of times these things aren't logged, particularly within Okta. Azure actually allows less of these. It's less flexible, which is how they have slightly better logging. But even if they are logged, they're logged in different places, not usually the system log. So like the import log or the persistence log. I forget what it's called in Azure, actually, off the top of my head. So this is a really good way to deal with this, right? Imagine if you broke into, or you're in an organization that has Workday as its mastered HR, and you set up Bamboo HR. That's pretty ingenious. You'd have to have a license for Bamboo HR, but you get the idea how this works, and you could, of course, reverse engineer it. Of course, there's the age-old capability to just deploy your user to a high-value application. So like, why can't I just take a user that I created and add them to AWS? That seems pretty important, and it's going to come up in a couple seconds when we talk about it. These are usually done at the application layer again, so if you want to see who's assigned, you're going to have to look at the application. Again, that makes detection really, really difficult, and it's something that happens every day. So you're not going to really see anything different within the logs, usually. You might see a different user do it, perhaps. And then, of course, if you have OAuth apps, they can be re-provisioned to use API scopes, which is sort of like a little trick that is just how these are configured within IDPs, usually. So if that makes sense to you, then excellent. If it doesn't, well, we can talk afterwards. Cool. So we're starting to get into the area of IDP-specific-ish stuff, or things outside of the IDP. But they're also really valuable attack vectors. So low code, no code, even high code, whatever that is, full code, are really good vectors to persist. So you can start talking about things like using your access to attack things like Boomi, or maybe a source system that's definitely going to have API access to these IDPs. Or you could use built-in versions of these. So for instance, like in Okta, this would be workflows, Azuqua. Other things that some IDPs have are webhooks, inline hooks in Okta, not really available in Azure. But these are particularly useful because you can ship off a SAML assertion to an endpoint you control and then move it back afterwards. And so at your behest, you can then steal SAML assertions or OAuth tokens, which is pretty nice. But very complicated to configure for most admins. Not a lot of people go into the inline hooks section on a common basis. All right, there are some IDP-specific flows. I'm not going to talk about these, mostly because my voice is giving out, as you can hear, but secondarily because I want to leave 5 minutes for questions. So with that, thank you very much for giving me the 25 minutes to talk. And are there any questions? Sure. So the question was, you spoke about Okta and Azure AD. What are the top detection mechanisms that you're looking for within your environments? Or that I don't see offered today? Well, effectively, none of those are offered, or they're offered in the sense that logs are available, right? This is, in some sense, the shared responsibility model, where the vendor says, I'm going to provide you logs, and you're responsible for looking at them yourself. So there are no real detections upon those that I'm aware of, but I'm more than happy to be corrected on that. Does that answer the question? Okay. Any follow-up questions or any other questions? So that was a long question that I'm going to try and summarize as like, what is your opinion of using configuration management to manage cloud IDPs? And is it worth it, I guess? Yeah, all right, cool. I actually think I'm very strongly opinionated on this, so I'm glad that you asked that question. I think it shows a lot of foresight into where we're going to see this go. These sort of DevOps-y approaches that have historically been like the Puppets, the Ansibles, the Terraforms of the world have provided a way to stop this type of attack largely, or at least partially, within things like AWS and Azure as a cloud provider, things like that. Applying them to IDPs is sort of this next level of challenge, because it's really good for technical security teams and technical IT teams, but when you start getting into your IT help desk, they might not want to push some code to reset a user account. That's not to say that you can't build something on top of that. I think that's really where we're going to end up seeing role-based access control in conjunction with configuration as code to affect that change. And once these are complete, you really get a much better picture, especially when you start tagging them with things like drift detection in Terraform and Puppet as well, that you can start saying, like, these are my rules for groups, these are my applications, and they shan't be configured outside of this, and they all require a +1 in GitHub. Things that we've done for years within the development space that we just don't do within the IT space because it sort of came up in its own silo. So it's a very astute thing. I think it's a really valuable capability, even if you can't use it for everything. It also just stops you from messing up. Things like group rules being in a repo instead of being like manually put in, much more effective. And of course, you can do validation of them as well. I think we have time for, one last question, or maybe two. Great question. So maybe
not for intrusion detection, but at least to be able to say who made the boo-boo, blame management, right?
Yeah. So the question is like, what are you doing to try and make the problem better, right? Yeah, push the vendor. I mean, like the straightforward answers, I'm trying to get a job at a company that has a much bigger budget to spend on this so that I can push the vendor, right? Like that's the joke answer, but sort of true. Yeah, these representatives are here today at Identiverse. You can talk to them. There you go. One's willingly raising his hand, which is bold. Congratulations, good job. We've spotted the Fed, so to speak. That's probably the most effective way to do that. Additionally, there's a lot of other vendors around who are trying to do other sort of interesting ways around these problems. So there are people who are using like SSO URL overrides, which is something I didn't really talk about but mentioned at the end, to man-in-the-middle SAML connections so that they can see when these changes occur. Or you can start thinking about your CASBs that have usually TLS termination and could observe these. Or Chrome extensions that could be added that could watch and do re-ups during this process, right? There's a lot of ways that vendors can inject themselves forcefully when other vendors don't do, I'm not gonna aggressively say like fail in their responsibility in the shared responsibility model, but like could improve in various ways. Maybe that's the more political way to say that. Does that answer your question a little bit? The answer is like, no, there's not much to do, right? Like you could just pressure people. And I agree, it's a problem. Cool. We are a minute over. I can't believe that I actually made it in time. So thank you, everybody, and have a great lunch.